Taeho stared at the legal documents spread across his small apartment table and wondered if the lawyers had made some terrible mistake. The papers said his uncle Veltar had died in a gravity drive accident somewhere near Jupiter and left him a spaceship. Not just any spaceship, but a 200-meter-long Nexari exploration vessel called Star Whisper. Taeho had only met his uncle 3 times in his 19 years of life, and each meeting had been strange beyond words. Uncle Veltar was his mother's brother, which made no sense because his mother was completely human and born in Seoul. She had never explained how she ended up with an alien brother who looked like a tall blue person with too many fingers. Every time Taeho asked about it, his mother would change the subject and start cooking something elaborate. The mystery had bothered him for years, but now Uncle Veltar was dead, and somehow Taeho owned a spaceship. The lawyer who delivered the papers was also blue, and had the same too many fingers as Uncle Veltar. She spoke perfect Korean, but her accent was musical in a way that hurt Taeho's ears. She explained that according to Nexari law, any blood relative could inherit technological assets, and that genetic testing had confirmed Taeho qualified. When Taeho asked what genetic testing, she smiled with too many teeth and said the testing had been automatic upon his birth. 2 days later, Taeho stood in the private spaceport outside Seoul, looking up at Star Whisper and trying to understand how something so beautiful could belong to him. The ship looked like it had been grown rather than built, with smooth curves that flowed from nose to tail like frozen music. The hull shimmered with colors that changed depending on how the light hit it, and the whole thing hummed with barely contained energy. Taeho had studied engineering at Seoul National University for 2 years before dropping out to work in his friend's repair shop, but he had never seen anything like this. Soo-jin arrived while he was still staring at the ship. She parked her motorcycle next to the security fence and walked over with that confident stride that had made her the best pilot trainee in their class before she also dropped out of university. Soo-jin had been his best friend since they were 7 years old, and she was the only person who knew about his strange uncle and his even stranger family situation. Soo-jin looked at the ship and whistled low. She walked around it twice while Taeho fumbled with the access codes the lawyer had given him. When the main hatch finally opened with a soft hiss, Soo-jin was already talking about fuel costs and maintenance requirements and how they could never afford to keep something like this running. Taeho was not listening because he was looking at the ship's interior and realizing that his uncle had designed it for someone exactly his size. The control systems were labeled in Korean and English, along with the flowing Nexari script. The audio pilot seat adjusted perfectly to Taeho's height, and the interface screens lit up when he touched them. Soo-jin sat in the co-pilot chair and started reading through the system diagnostics, while Taeho explored the engineering sections. Everything was clean and efficient and slightly alien, but somehow familiar, like a song he had heard in a dream. They spent the morning learning the ship's basic systems. Soo-jin figured out the navigation computer while Taeho mapped the power distribution networks. The ship had 3 main drives, including something called a gravity manipulator that could apparently make local changes to space-time. The weapon systems were minimal, just some defensive screens and a single particle beam that the computer classified as useful for clearing space debris. Uncle Veltar had apparently been a peaceful explorer, not a warrior. Around noon, the first news reports started coming in. Soo-jin had left the communication system running, and suddenly every channel was broadcasting emergency alerts. Ships had appeared in Earth's outer solar system, dozens of them. They were not responding to any attempts at communication, and they were moving toward Earth in a formation that looked decidedly hostile. The news anchors kept using words like unprecedented and first contact while trying to stay calm, but Taeho could hear the fear in their voices. By evening, the situation had become much worse. The alien ships had reached Mars orbit and were broadcasting a message in perfect English, Chinese, and a dozen other Earth languages. The message was simple and terrifying. Earth had been designated as a threat to galactic stability. Human expansion into space violated several ancient treaties. Humanity had 7 days to surrender all space-based assets and submit to galactic hegemony authority or face immediate pacification. Taeho and Soo-jin watched the broadcasts from Star Whisper's main lounge while the ship's computer quietly analyzed the alien transmission. The computer identified the attackers as a military alliance called the Hegemony, made up of 12 different species that controlled most of the local galactic arm. According to the ship's database, the Hegemony considered rapid technological development to be a sign of dangerous instability, and they had pacified 17 other species in the past 1,000 years. The computer also explained why Uncle Veltar had never told anyone about his relationship to Teho's family. The Nexari were one of only 3 species that had refused to join the Hegemony, and they lived as refugees scattered across the galaxy. Any planet that harbored Nexari technology or personnel faced immediate retaliation. Uncle Veltar had been hiding on Earth for 30 years and keeping his distance from family to protect them. On the second day of the crisis, Earth's military tried to negotiate. The Hegemony response was swift and brutal. 3 orbital defense stations were destroyed in seconds by weapons that seemed to ignore all known physical laws. The alien ships moved through Earth's defensive fire like it was not even there. Their shields absorbed everything from nuclear missiles to particle beam weapons without showing any sign of damage. Su-Jin spent that day learning Star Whisper's defensive systems while Teho dove deep into the engineering databases. What he found made him both excited and terrified. Nexari technology was centuries ahead of anything humans had developed, but it was also modular in ways that human engineers had never considered. Every system on the ship could be reconfigured and rebuilt with the right knowledge and tools. More importantly, the ship's manufacturing bay could produce almost anything given enough raw materials and energy. Uncle Veltar had apparently been a tinkerer who liked to rebuild things in new and interesting ways. The manufacturing systems had templates for thousands of different devices, and the computer was happy to explain how any of them worked. On the third day, the Hegemony demonstrated what pacification meant. They targeted a small military base in the Australian desert and simply erased it. Not destroyed or bombed, but completely removed from existence, leaving behind a perfectly smooth crater, 5 kilometers across. The message was clear. Humanity could surrender or be deleted. That night, Teho could not sleep. He walked through Star Whisper's corridors, looking at the elegant curves and efficient designs and thinking about the problem in front of them. The Hegemony had weapons and shields that made human technology look like stone tools, but they also seemed to think in very predictable ways. Their ships moved in perfect formations, and their tactics followed patterns that suggested they had been fighting the same types of battles for centuries. Su-Jin found him in the manufacturing bay at 3 a.m, staring at a half-assembled gravity manipulator. She sat down next to him and asked what he was thinking. Teho looked at the beautiful alien technology, and then at his own hands, and realized something that made him smile for the first time in days. The Hegemony expected humans to fight like every other species they had encountered. They expected space battles with ships and formations and predictable tactics. But humans were different. Humans took things apart and put them back together in ways that made no sense to anyone else. Humans looked at problems sideways and found solutions that should not work but did anyway. Teho looked at Su-Jin and said he had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. He was going to turn Uncle Veltar's beautiful exploration ship into something the galaxy had never seen before. Something that would make the Hegemony wish they had never heard of Earth. Su-Jin stared at the holographic display floating above the manufacturing bay table and tried to understand what Teho was proposing. The 3-dimensional blueprint showed Star Whisper broken apart and reassembled into something that looked like a giant person made of metal and energy. Arms and legs and a torso with the ship's main hull forming the chest section, and the drive units repositioned to provide movement for massive limbs. Teho had been working on the design for 18 hours straight, surviving on coffee and excitement. His eyes were red from staring at computer screens, but he moved around the hologram, pointing out features with the enthusiasm of someone who had found the perfect solution to an impossible problem. The gravity manipulators would be installed in the joints to provide impossible strength and agility. The power core would be relocated to the center of the torso for better protection and weight distribution. The weapon systems would be upgraded and mounted in the arms to provide focused firepower. Su-Jin had seen enough mech anime to understand the basic concept, but she had also studied enough engineering to know that most of it was impossible. Giant, Walking robots were unstable and inefficient compared to conventional vehicles. The square cube law meant that anything that large would collapse under its own weight. The power requirements would be enormous, and the control systems would be too complex for any human to operate effectively. Taeho listened to her objections and then showed her why they were wrong. Nexari gravity manipulation technology could solve the weight problem by selectively reducing mass in different parts of the structure. The power core could generate more energy than Earth's entire electrical grid. The control systems could be networked with human neural interfaces to allow instinctive operation. Most importantly, the modular design meant they could test each system individually before attempting full transformation. The real genius of the plan was not the engineering, but the psychology. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy fought the same way, with ships and formations following predictable tactical patterns. The hegemony had centuries of experience defeating that kind of warfare. But no one had ever seen a 200-meter-tall bipedal combat unit that could move like a person and fight like a spaceship. The enemy would have no tactical doctrine for dealing with something that could walk and run and jump while firing weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat. Sujin was still skeptical, but she agreed to help because the alternative was watching Earth get erased by aliens who thought humans were too dangerous to live. Besides, she had always wanted to pilot something that had never existed before. If they were going to die fighting impossible odds, they might as well do it in the most ridiculous way possible. The first challenge was finding a place to work. Star Whisper was too big to fit in any normal repair facility, and the transformation would require heavy manufacturing equipment that they could not afford to buy. Taeho solved the problem by calling his old university advisor, Professor Lee Dong-woo, who ran a government research lab that specialized in experimental military hardware. Dong-woo had been trying to reverse engineer captured alien technology since the hegemony ships arrived, but he was making little progress. The alien systems were too advanced and too different from human engineering principles. When Taeho explained his plan, Dong-woo was immediately interested, not because he thought it would work, but because it was the most creative approach to the problem anyone had suggested. 3 days later, Star Whisper was hidden in an underground facility beneath the Seoul Defense Research Institute. The lab was normally used for testing experimental aircraft, but it was large enough to accommodate a small spaceship, and it had the manufacturing tools they needed. More importantly, it was connected to the military's classified network, which gave them access to weapon systems and armor materials that were not available to civilians. Dongwoo assigned a team of his best engineers to the project, but made it clear that they were working on their own time. Officially, the government could not support such an insane plan. Unofficially, everyone knew that conventional weapons were useless against hegemony technology, so they were willing to try anything that might work. The transformation began with careful disassembly. Every system on Star Whisper had to be removed and cataloged before it could be reinstalled in a new configuration. The process was complicated by the fact that Nexari technology was grown rather than assembled, which meant that some components could not be separated without destroying them. Taeho had to learn to use the ship's own manufacturing bay to create new interface systems that could bridge the gap between alien and human engineering. Sujin focused on the control systems. The original pilot interface was designed for exploration and navigation, not combat. She needed to create new input methods that would allow a human operator to control enormous limbs with precision while managing weapons and defense systems. The solution was a combination of motion capture technology and direct neural feedback that would let the pilot move naturally while the computer translated those movements into mechanical action. The work was exhausting and often frustrating. Nexari systems were elegant but alien, and they did not always behave the way human engineers expected. The gravity manipulators had safety protocols that prevented them from being used as structural support. The power distribution networks were optimized for smooth energy flow, not the sudden demands of combat systems. Every day brought new problems that required creative solutions. Meanwhile, Earth's situation continued to deteriorate. The hegemony had positioned ships at strategic points throughout the solar system, and was systematically destroying any human presence in space. The International Space Station was vaporized as a demonstration. Military satellites were picked off one by one. The message was clear that humanity's time was running out. News reports showed panic in major cities as people realized their governments were powerless to protect them. Some countries attempted to surrender independently, but the hegemony ignored all diplomatic overtures. They had apparently decided that humans were too unpredictable to be allowed to continue existing as a technological species. The only good news came from other secret projects around the world. Teiho's design had been shared through classified channels, and teams in different countries were attempting their own variations. A group in Japan was trying to convert a nuclear submarine into a walking weapons platform. Engineers in Germany were working on a transforming space fighter. The Americans were characteristically attempting to build the largest possible version, using parts from a mothballed aircraft carrier. None of the other projects were as advanced as the Seoul team, partly because they did not have access to Nexari technology. But the distributed effort meant that even if Star Whisper failed, there might be other options. More importantly, it meant that the enemy would face multiple unknown threats instead of just one. After 6 weeks of round-the-clock work, the transformation was finally complete. What had once been an elegant exploration vessel was now something that looked like a mechanical giant built by someone with too much imagination and not enough regard for conventional physics. The proportions were all wrong by human standards, but the alien technology made it work anyway. The test activation was scheduled for early morning when the lab would be mostly empty. Sujin climbed into the redesigned cockpit, which was now located in what would be the head of the mechanical form. Banks of screens showed her views from cameras located throughout the structure, while haptic feedback systems connected her nervous system to the machine's sensors. Teiho monitored the process from the engineering station, watching power levels and system status displays, while Dongwu supervised from the control room above. Everyone was nervous because they were attempting something that had never been tried before with technology they did not fully understand. The transformation sequence began slowly. Star Whisper's hull sections separated along new joint lines and began to reconfigure themselves using a combination of mechanical actuators and gravity manipulation. What had been the ship's nose became an arm complete with manipulator hands adapted from the original docking systems. The rear hull split to form legs with the main drive units repositioned to provide thrust for jumping and rapid movement. Sujin felt the change through the neural interface, as if she was growing new limbs. The sensation was disorienting at first, but the control software helped her adapt by translating her intentions into appropriate mechanical responses. When she tried to stand up, the massive form rose to its full height with surprising grace. The first test movements were clumsy but encouraging. The mechanical giant could walk and gesture and even perform simple tasks with its manipulator hands. More importantly, it could access all of Star Whisper's original systems, including the weapons and defenses that had been integrated into the new configuration. Dongwu called down from the control room to say that they had successfully created the most powerful infantry unit in human history. Sujin laughed and corrected him. They had not created an infantry unit. They had created something entirely new that would make their enemies question everything they thought they knew about warfare. Teiho was already planning the next phase. The hegemony forward base sat in a valley between two mountains like a collection of crystalline growths that had sprouted from the rocky ground. Intelligence reports said it housed approximately 200 alien personnel and was defended by automated weapon systems designed to destroy aircraft and ground vehicles. The base generators powered a defensive screen that could deflect most conventional weapons, and the communication arrays maintained constant contact with the main fleet in orbit. Sujin piloted the transformed Star Whisper through the mountain forests using terrain masking to avoid detection. The mechanical giant moved with surprising stealth for something so large, partly because the gravity manipulators dampened its footsteps, and partly because Nexari technology was naturally quiet. Trees bent aside as it passed, and small streams were crossed in single steps, but the forest remained relatively undisturbed. Teiho monitored the approach from his engineering station, watching for signs that they had been detected, while running final checks on weapons and defensive systems. The particle beam cannons were charged and ready. The gravity pulse generators were calibrated for maximum disruption. The defensive screens were operating at full power, and the structural integrity fields were holding steady. From the command center back at the research facility, Dongwu tracked their progress using satellites and ground sensors while maintaining radio silence to avoid alerting enemy monitoring systems. The plan was simple in concept, but unprecedented in execution. They would attack the base using tactics that no spacefaring species had ever employed, because no one had ever built a giant walking weapons platform before. The aliens in the base were completely unprepared for what emerged from the forest. Their sensors were designed to detect aircraft and vehicles and spacecraft, but they had no classification for a 200-meter-tall bipedal form that moved like a living creature. The first indication of trouble came when automated defense turrets began tracking the intruder, but could not identify what they were looking at. Sujin felt the enemy weapons lock onto her position through the sensor network and responded instinctively. Instead of taking evasive action like a normal vehicle, she made the giant drop into a crouch behind a ridgeline using terrain for cover in a way that confused the targeting computers. The defensive turrets continued to track empty air, while their target disappeared below the horizon. The first attack came without warning when Sujin stood up and fired both particle beam cannons simultaneously. The alien base's defensive screens flared as they absorbed the energy, but the weapons were designed for ship-to-ship combat and delivered far more power than the base systems could handle. Sections of the defensive grid overloaded and failed, creating gaps in the protection. What happened next violated every principle of civilized warfare that the hegemony understood. Instead of maintaining a safe distance and exchanging fire like proper military units, the giant mechanical form charged directly at the base using its legs to cover ground at impossible speed. Gravity manipulation allowed it to leap over obstacles and change direction in midair, while continuing to fire weapons in patterns that seemed completely random. The base defense systems had been programmed to fight vehicles that moved in predictable patterns along roads or aircraft that followed ballistic trajectories. They had no protocols for dealing with something that could jump sideways while running forward and firing weapons in multiple directions. Targeting computers crashed as they tried to calculate firing solutions for a target that refused to behave like any known type of military hardware. Sujin discovered that controlling the giant form in combat was like learning to dance while juggling fire. Every movement required coordination between multiple systems, and the neural interface translated her intentions into mechanical action with only millisecond delays. When she wanted to dodge left, the entire structure would pivot and leap using gravity manipulation to enhance natural movement. When she wanted to attack, the weapon systems would automatically track targets while she focused on positioning. The aliens inside the base were equally confused, but they responded with typical hegemony efficiency. Mobile weapon platforms emerged from concealed positions and began firing plasma charges while aerospace fighters launched from hidden landing pads. The counterattack was swift and professional, and would have been devastating against any conventional opponent. But Sujin was not piloting a conventional opponent. When plasma charges streaked toward her position, she made the giant roll sideways behind a rocky outcrop, like a person taking cover from gunfire. The movement was completely impossible for any normal military vehicle, but the gravity manipulators made it as natural as breathing. Enemy targeting systems lost lock and had to recalculate while their target disappeared and reappeared in unexpected locations. Taeho watched the battle unfold through multiple camera feeds while managing power distribution and damage control. The defensive screens were holding against enemy fire, but some shots were getting through and causing minor structural damage. More concerning was the fact that the enemy was adapting their tactics faster than expected. The aerospace fighters were beginning to coordinate their attacks in ways that would be difficult to counter. The solution came when Sujin realized she was still thinking like a pilot instead of thinking like a giant person with energy weapons for hands. Instead of trying to evade the enemy fighters, she waited until they were committed to an attack run, and then swatted them out of the air using the mechanical arms as if she was brushing away insects. The gesture was casual and devastating, and completely outside the enemy's understanding of how combat was supposed to work. 3 fighters were destroyed in as many seconds using a tactic that had never been attempted in the history of galactic warfare. The remaining pilots broke formation and retreated while broadcasting emergency signals to their command structure. Sujin used the breathing space to focus on the ground defenses, which were still trying to target her using conventional fire control systems. The base's main defensive turret was housed in a crystalline tower that rose from the center of the complex. It was designed to engage spacecraft at orbital distances, and its plasma cannon could theoretically penetrate the defensive screens if it achieved a direct hit. But the turret was also designed to track fast-moving targets at extreme range, not something that was close enough to reach out and touch. Sujin walked directly to the tower while absorbing fire from smaller weapons and simply grabbed the main turret with both mechanical hands. The structure was built to withstand weapon impacts, but not physical manipulation by something strong enough to lift spacecraft. Gravity-enhanced strength allowed her to twist the entire assembly until it broke free from its mounting and could be thrown aside like a discarded toy. The psychological effect on the enemy was immediate and profound. Hegemony forces were trained to fight technological opponents using advanced weapons and sophisticated tactics. They were not prepared to deal with something that fought like a barbarian giant who happened to have energy cannons instead of a club. The remaining defenders began to retreat toward their evacuation craft while broadcasting surrender signals. But Sujin was not finished demonstrating the tactical advantages of her impossible machine. She chased down the fleeing vehicles on foot, using the giant's enhanced mobility to keep pace with aircraft while firing weapons designed to disable rather than destroy. Gravity pulse generators created localized distortions that forced enemy craft to land, while particle beams targeted propulsion systems with surgical precision. Within 20 minutes of the initial attack, the entire hegemony force had been neutralized, with minimal casualties on either side. The base's communication arrays had been destroyed to prevent reports to the main fleet, but most of the personnel had been captured rather than killed. Sujin stood among the wreckage of crystalline structures and disabled vehicles, and realized they had just proven something that would change the course of the war. Taiho was already analyzing combat data and planning improvements to their tactics. The giant form had performed better than expected, but there were systems that could be optimized and weapons that could be upgraded. More importantly, they had demonstrated that human creativity could overcome hegemony technological advantages through unconventional approaches that the enemy could not predict or counter. Dongwu's voice crackled through the communication system with barely contained excitement. Satellite imagery had recorded the entire battle, and the footage was already being transmitted to other research teams around the world. The proof of concept was complete, and now they could begin mass production of similar units using whatever alien technology could be salvaged from defeated hegemony forces. But the real victory was not tactical or technological. It was psychological. For the first time since the crisis began, humans had struck back against their would-be conquerors and won a decisive victory. The hegemony's aura of invincibility had been shattered by something that looked like it belonged in a children's cartoon rather than a serious military conflict. Sujin piloted the giant form back toward the research facility while Taiho compiled battle reports and damage assessments. General Kavthon studied the battle footage from the Korean forward base for the 7th time and tried to understand what he was seeing. The recording showed a hegemony military installation being destroyed by something that his tactical computers refused to classify. It moved like a living creature but was obviously mechanical. It fought like a barbarian but used advanced energy weapons. Most disturbing of all, it employed combat techniques that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The general had commanded hegemony pacification forces for 3 centuries and had successfully neutralized 17 different species. Some had been technologically advanced. Others had been numerous enough to require sustained campaigns. A few had even been clever enough to force tactical adaptations. But none had ever done anything like this. The human response to superior firepower was supposed to follow predictable patterns. They should have attempted to negotiate from a position of weakness. They should have tried to build defensive installations using conventional engineering principles. They should have developed new weapons systems based on existing technological foundations. Instead, they had taken alien technology and transformed it into something completely unprecedented. Kavthon activated the fleet communication system and addressed his subordinate commanders through encrypted channels. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that were not included in any intelligence assessments. Their ability to rapidly adapt and modify captured technology exceeded anything in hegemony experience. More concerning was their apparent willingness to abandon traditional tactical doctrine in favor of completely novel approaches. The response was immediate escalation. Kavthon ordered Planet Killer-class dreadnoughts to move into Earth orbit, while assault squadrons prepared for coordinated attacks on all major population centers. The humans had made it clear they would not surrender peacefully, so the only remaining option was complete extermination, followed by planetary sterilization to ensure no technological remnants survived. But the general had underestimated how quickly human engineers could work when motivated by impending extinction. The technical specifications from the Korean battle had been distributed to research facilities around the world within hours. Teams that had been struggling with basic alien technology suddenly had blueprints for advanced applications and examples of successful human Nexari integration. The Japanese team had completed their submarine conversion in a secret facility beneath Tokyo Bay. Instead of trying to replicate Star Whisper's bipedal design, they had created something that looked like a mechanical sea monster, with multiple weapon systems and the ability to operate underwater or on land. The neural interface was different, but the basic principles were the same, and the pilot could control massive mechanical limbs with human intuition, enhanced by alien technology. In Germany, the engineers had taken a different approach entirely. They had built their machine around a captured hegemony fighter, using reverse-engineered gravity manipulation to create something that could transform between aircraft and humanoid configurations. The result was smaller than the other units, but faster and more agile, with the ability to engage enemy forces in three-dimensional aerial combat. The American project was characteristically ambitious and excessive. They had started with a decommissioned aircraft carrier and added enough alien technology to create a walking fortress that could deploy smaller mechanical units while providing heavy fire support. The control system required a crew of 12, but the firepower was equivalent to an entire naval battle group concentrated in a single mobile platform. More projects were coming online every day as teams around the world shared information and competed to create the most effective variations. The basic concept was spreading faster than any conventional military technology because it combined human creativity with alien capabilities in ways that produced immediate results. Each team brought different cultural perspectives and engineering traditions to the same fundamental challenge. Kavthon learned about the proliferation when his scouts reported unusual energy signatures from multiple locations around the planet. Long-range sensors detected gravitational anomalies consistent with Nexari technology, but the patterns were wrong. Instead of the elegant efficiency typical of advanced civilizations, the readings showed crude, powerful applications that suggested someone was using sophisticated tools for primitive purposes. The first major engagement came when hegemony assault forces attempted to destroy the Tokyo facility. The attack was planned using standard pacification protocols with orbital bombardment, followed by ground forces to eliminate any survivors. But the submarine-derived mechanical unit was waiting beneath the bay and emerged just as the enemy ships entered the atmosphere. What followed was unlike any battle in recorded galactic history. The mechanical sea monster used water as both concealment and propulsion, while engaging aerospace fighters with weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat. Its multiple arms allowed simultaneous attacks against different targets, while gravity manipulation let it move through water faster than most aircraft could fly. Enemy pilots found themselves being dragged underwater by something that should not have been able to catch them. Similar battles erupted at facilities around the world as hegemony forces encountered mechanical giants that fought with no regard for conventional tactics. Each engagement was different because each human team had approached the same basic concept from different cultural and engineering perspectives. The results were equally effective and equally incomprehensible to enemies trained in standardized warfare. Tejo watched the global conflict unfold from the Seoul facility while making final preparations for Star Whisper's next deployment. Intelligence reports showed that Kavthon was concentrating his main fleet for a massive assault that would overwhelm Earth's defenses through sheer firepower. The plan was logical and would probably succeed unless something disrupted the enemy's coordination at a critical moment. Su-jin had been practicing advanced maneuvers in the underground facility, while Dongwu's team installed upgraded weapon systems and enhanced defensive screens. The battle experience from the forward base had revealed several areas for improvement, and the modifications would make their machines significantly more effective in space combat. But even an improved Star Whisper could not fight an entire fleet by itself. The solution came from an unexpected source when the ship's computer detected incoming transmissions from other Nexari refugees scattered throughout the solar system. Uncle Veltar had apparently been part of a larger community that had been hiding among the human population for decades. The crisis had forced them to reveal themselves, and they were offering technological assistance to help defend their adopted home. The refugees brought advanced manufacturing equipment and weapons systems that could be integrated with human-built mechanical units to create hybrid technologies that neither species could have developed alone. More importantly, they brought detailed intelligence about hegemony fleet dispositions and tactical doctrine that would allow human forces to coordinate their attacks for maximum effectiveness. The plan that emerged from the combined human and Nexari intelligence was audacious even by the standards of a species that had turned exploration ships into giant walking weapons. Instead of trying to defend Earth from the approaching fleet, they would launch a coordinated assault on the enemy flagship, while the hegemony forces were still organizing their attack formation. Kavthon's command dreadnought was a kilometer-long fortress that carried enough firepower to sterilize a planet and enough defensive systems to survive anything less than a coordinated fleet action. It was positioned at the center of the hegemony formation, where it could coordinate the assault while remaining protected by layers of escort vessels and defensive screens. But the general had never faced an enemy that could walk through space, using gravity manipulation while firing weapons designed for much larger spacecraft. The human mechanical units were small enough to avoid detection until they were close enough to engage, but powerful enough to threaten capital ships once they achieved firing positions. The combination of stealth and firepower was unprecedented in hegemony experience. The assault began when mechanical giants emerged from concealment throughout the solar system and began moving toward the enemy fleet using trajectories that made no tactical sense. They approached from multiple directions at different speeds while maintaining communication silence and using passive sensors to avoid detection. To hegemony observers, they looked like debris or asteroids until they activated their weapon systems at point-blank range. Su-jin piloted Star Whisper through the chaotic battle while Taeho managed weapons and defensive systems against targets that were designed to fight formations of conventional spacecraft. Enemy ships were too large and well-armed to be destroyed quickly, but they were also too slow and predictable to effectively target something that moved like a person rather than a vehicle. The mechanical giants used tactics that had never been attempted in space combat. They grabbed onto enemy ships and used them as shields while attacking other targets. They threw disabled fighters at larger vessels like oversized projectiles. General Kavthon stood in the emergency command center aboard his damaged flagship and watched displays that showed the complete collapse of everything he had believed about warfare. Half his fleet was retreating in disorder, while the other half was trapped in running battles with mechanical giants that seemed to defy every law of physics and tactics. 3 centuries of military experience had not prepared him for enemies that fought like mythological creatures, armed with advanced technology. The general's pride would not allow him to accept defeat at the hands of a primitive species that had only achieved spaceflight within the last century. He activated the flagship's experimental weapon systems that had been held in reserve for extreme situations. The gravitational lance could theoretically tear apart small moons, and the quantum disruptor field could eliminate matter at the subatomic level. Both weapons violated several galactic treaties, but the hegemony had always been willing to ignore such restrictions when facing existential threats. Su-jin felt the massive energy build up through Star Whisper's sensor networks and realized the enemy commander was preparing to deploy weapons that could destroy everything within a significant radius, including his own ships. The readings were unlike anything in the alien technology database, and the tactical computer could only estimate the potential destruction based on energy output. Whatever was charging up in the enemy flagship could probably eliminate several mechanical units and a large portion of the human fleet simultaneously. Tae-ho made rapid calculations while monitoring the enemy weapon systems and concluded that conventional evasion would be impossible. The gravitational lance had enough range to target anything within the inner solar system, while the quantum disruptor could affect local spacetime in ways that would make escape difficult. Their only option was to attack the source before it could fire, which meant getting close enough to a weapon that could unmake matter at the fundamental level. The solution required something that neither human nor Nexari technology could accomplish alone, but their combination might make possible. Tae-ho began overloading Star Whisper's gravity manipulation systems, while Soo-jin pushed the mechanical giant toward the enemy flagship at maximum acceleration. The plan was insane, but it was also the only chance they had to prevent weapons of mass destruction from being used against Earth. What happened next violated several fundamental principles of physics and engineering, but worked anyway because human desperation combined with alien technology could produce results that neither species would have attempted individually. Tae-ho redirected all available power to the gravity manipulators and began creating localized space-time distortions that allowed Star Whisper to move through dimensions that technically did not exist. Soo-jin experienced the transition as a sensation, falling sideways through reality while mechanical systems adapted to conditions that should have been impossible. The neural interface maintained connection despite operating in space where normal matter behaved, according to rules that kept changing. For several seconds, Star Whisper existed in multiple locations simultaneously before emerging directly next to the enemy flagship. Kavthon watched his target disappear from all sensors only to reappear inside his defensive perimeter at point-blank range. The gravitational lance was fully charged but could not be fired without destroying his own ship along with the target. The quantum disruptor was still cycling up to full power and would need another 30 seconds to reach operational status. Those 30 seconds would determine the outcome of the entire war. Soo-jin did not waste time trying to understand how they had accomplished the impossible transition. She simply began attacking the enemy weapon systems using every tool available, while Tae-ho managed power distribution and damage control. Particle beam cannons fired continuously, while gravity pulse generators created interference patterns that disrupted the delicate calibration of experimental weapons. The mechanical giant's arms reached out to physically damage targeting systems that were too large to be affected by conventional attacks. The battle between Star Whisper and the hegemony flagship became a close-quarters brawl between technologies that represented completely different approaches to engineering and warfare. Alien precision met human improvisation in a contest that would have been impossible to predict and equally impossible to replicate. Neither side was fighting according to established doctrine because the situation was unprecedented in galactic history. Tae-ho felt something awakening in his genetic structure as the stress of combat activated dormant Nexari abilities that he had never known he possessed. His neural interface with the ship's systems deepened beyond anything previously achieved by human or alien operators. He began to understand technology at an intuitive level that allowed him to push every system beyond its designed limitations while maintaining perfect coordination. The transformation was visible to Soo-jin through the shared neural network as Tae-ho's consciousness expanded to encompass the entire mechanical giant. His human creativity combined with Nexari technological affinity to create something that was greater than the sum of its parts. Star Whisper began moving with fluid grace that made its previous performance look clumsy, while weapon systems achieved accuracy that should have required computer assistance. Kavthon realized that his enemy was evolving during combat in ways that his tactical training had not covered. The mechanical giant was becoming more dangerous with each passing second as its operators adapted to capabilities they were discovering in real time. His experimental weapons were powerful enough to destroy planets, but they were also too powerful to use at close range without ensuring mutual destruction. The general made the decision that would define his legacy in hegemony military history. He activated both weapon systems simultaneously, knowing that the resulting explosion would destroy his flagship along with everything else within a considerable radius. If he could not defeat the humans through superior technology, then he would at least ensure that their most dangerous assets were eliminated before they could threaten other hegemony territories. Jin felt the massive energy surge building in the enemy systems and knew they had perhaps seconds before both weapons fired. Normal evasion was impossible at this range, and the explosion would be too large to survive even with enhanced defensive screens. But Taeho was already implementing a solution that combined human insanity with alien technology in ways that should not have worked but did anyway. Instead of trying to escape the blast radius, Star Whisper began absorbing the energy from the charging weapons using gravity manipulation techniques that had never been attempted before. Taeho's enhanced abilities allowed him to create space-time distortions that could redirect the destructive force back toward its source while protecting the mechanical giant from the worst effects of weapons designed to eliminate matter at the quantum level. The result was a feedback loop that caused the Hegemony flagship's experimental weapons to overload and explode while contained within gravitational fields that channeled the destruction inward rather than outward. The massive vessel was consumed by its own ultimate weapons, while Star Whisper emerged from the explosion with only minor damage and significantly enhanced capabilities from having absorbed exotic energies. The psychological impact on the remaining Hegemony forces was immediate and profound. Their most powerful commander had been defeated by enemies using tactics that were theoretically impossible, and technologies that should not have been able to work together. More disturbing was the fact that the humans seemed to be improving their capabilities during combat through methods that no established scientific framework could explain. The retreat became a rout as individual Hegemony ships abandoned all coordination and fled toward the outer solar system while broadcasting emergency signals to distant territories. The humans had not simply defeated a superior force through conventional military action. They had demonstrated abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about technology and warfare that had been accepted throughout the galaxy for millennia. Jin piloted Star Whisper through the debris field that had once been the enemy flagship, while monitoring communications from human forces throughout the solar system. Every mechanical unit had survived the battle, and most had enhanced their capabilities through combat experience. The victory was complete, but the implications were only beginning to be understood. Taeho felt his expanded consciousness gradually returning to normal human parameters while maintaining enhanced connection to Nexari technology that would be permanent. The genetic activation had unlocked capabilities that had been dormant in his family line for generations and established precedents for future development. Humanity was evolving in ways that would have long-term consequences for their relationship with galactic civilization. The aftermath of the battle brought unprecedented changes to Earth's position in galactic affairs. News of the Hegemony defeat spread through established communication networks and prompted responses from species that had remained neutral during the conflict. Some offered diplomatic relations, while others requested technological assistance or military cooperation against common enemies.